In the darkest corner of the 9 realms, in a place the living are never meant to find, there is a ship being built. It has been under construction for longer than most civilizations have existed. It grows slowly, one piece at a time, added in the dark by no living hand. Its hull is pale and slightly curved. If you looked closely enough, you would recognize the material. You have seen it before, on your own hands, on the hands of people you have buried. It is built from the uncut fingernails and toenails of the human dead. The Norse called it Naglfar, the nail ship. And the oldest surviving texts carry a warning so specific it feels less like mythology and more like a threat directed at you personally. Cut the nails of your dead before you bury them, because every fingernail you leave uncut is another piece of the hull. Every careless burial is another plank in the deck. And when Naglfar is finally finished, when the last nail is laid into place and the ship is complete, it will set sail across a boiling sea, carrying the armies of chaos toward the final battlefield. We will come back to this ship, because when it finally launches, the world has already lost. But here is what you need to understand before we go any further. The gods knew about Naglfar. They knew about every single detail of what was coming. The 3 winters with no sun between them, the wolf breaking his chains, the serpent releasing the ocean, the fire giant with the sword brighter than the sun who would burn the world tree itself to ash. They knew the name of the battlefield. They knew which of them would die and at whose hands and in what sequence. And they built Asgard anyway. They raised the walls anyway. They filled the great hall of Valhalla with the chosen dead of Midgard and trained them for centuries for a war that the prophecy already said they would lose. Stay with me here, because this is not the story most people think they know. This is not the Wagner opera, that 19th century theatrical reimagining that gave the world the phrase "Twilight of the Gods" and painted Ragnarok as something melancholy and beautiful. This is not the Marvel film franchise, with its brightly lit Bifrost bridges and its sanitized family drama dressed in superhero armor. This is not a comfortable bedtime story about a cycle of destruction and rebirth designed to make the ending feel hopeful. This is the actual story. The one written down by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century prose Edda, compiled from oral traditions that stretch back 1,000 years before him. The one preserved in the Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, where a dead woman is raised from her grave by a one-eyed king who already knows everything she is about to tell him and asks her anyway. The Old Norse word is Ragnarok, not Götterdämmerung, not the twilight of the gods. Ragnarok. It is a compound word. Ragnar, meaning the gods, the ruling powers, combined with Rok, which does not mean twilight at all. Rok means fate, doom, the reason behind all things, the reckoning. Ragnarok is not the twilight of the gods. It is the doom of the ruling powers. There is a difference, and that difference is the entire point of the story. A twilight is passive. It happens to you while you stand still and watch the light fade. A doom, a reckoning, is something you walk toward with your eyes open, your weapons drawn, and the full knowledge of what waits for you on the other side. The gods of Asgard did not stumble into Ragnarok. They marched into it. They had centuries to prepare. They spent every one of those centuries looking directly at the prophecy, measuring the distance between themselves and the end, and choosing, deliberately, consciously, with full knowledge, to keep fighting anyway. That choice is the darkest thing the Norse mythological tradition ever put into writing, and it is also, somehow, the most human. To understand why the gods marched toward a war they knew they could not win, you have to understand what Odin did long before the first sign of Ragnarok appeared. He went to find a dead woman, not a goddess, not a Valkyrie, a Volva, a seeress, a practitioner of the ancient Norse magic called Seidr, which the Eddas describe as the ability to perceive the threads of fate itself and, in rare cases, pull them. She had been dead for some time. Odin rode down from Asgard, past the roots of Yggdrasil, past the realm of the frost giants, down into the cold earth where the dead are kept, and he called her back. The Voluspa opens at this exact moment. You are inside Odin's perspective as the seeress opens her eyes and speaks. And what she tells him is not vague. It is not symbolic. It is a precise, sequential account of every catastrophe that will end the world, delivered in the calm, flat tone of someone describing something that has already happened. She tells him about Baldr. She tells him about Loki. She tells him about 3 winters that will arrive back to back with no summer between them, when the sun will go dark and the moral bonds between human beings will dissolve entirely, when brother will kill brother and no oath will hold, and the world of men will collapse under the weight of its own hunger and desperation before a single giant has taken a single step toward Asgard. She tells him about Fenrir breaking his chains, about Jormungandr releasing the ocean floor, about Naglfar setting sail. Odin listens to all of it, and then, here is the detail the modern adaptations almost always overlook. He goes home and starts building. Not an escape route, not a weapon to destroy the prophecy itself. He builds Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. He sends the Valkyries out across the battlefields of Midgard with specific instructions. Find the greatest warriors, the ones who die with weapons in their hands, and bring them here. Every day in Valhalla, the Einherjar, the chosen dead, wake up, fight each other to pieces, heal, feast, and do it again. For centuries. The word Einherjar in Old Norse carries a meaning that translation flattens almost beyond recognition. Eina means one or alone. Heri means army. The Einherjar are, literally, those who fight alone. Warriors selected not for their loyalty to Asgard, but for their individual capacity to keep fighting when everything around them has already broken. Odin chose them specifically because he needed soldiers who would not stop when the battle turned impossible. Because he already knew the battle would turn impossible. This is the first thing you need to understand about Ragnarok. It was never about victory. It was about the quality of the resistance. But the oldest, darkest domino, the one the Prose Edda describes as the moment the gods first felt genuine fear, was not the prophecy itself. It was the wolf. Fenrir was born in Jotunheimr, the realm of the giants, to Loki and a giantess named Angrboda. He had 2 siblings, Jormungandr, the serpent who would circle the world ocean, and Hel, the half-living, half-dead goddess who would rule the realm of the ordinary dead. When Odin learned of their existence, he acted immediately. He cast Jormungandr into the ocean surrounding Midgard. He sent Hel to govern the realm of the dead beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. And he brought Fenrir to Asgard, to raise him personally. You have to sit with that decision for a moment, because it is one of the strangest choices in the entire Eddic tradition. Odin, who had already consulted the seeress, who already knew what Fenrir would become, chose to bring the wolf into his own hall and raise him among the gods. The Prose Edda says only the god Tyr was brave enough to approach Fenrir and feed him. Every other deity in Asgard kept their distance, watching the wolf grow from a creature they could lift in their arms into something that made the walls of Asgard feel suddenly, terrifyingly small. Here is what the modern adaptations completely look past. The first chain they tried was called lading, ordinary iron, heavy and thick, the kind used to hold ships in harbor during storms. Fenrir looked at it. Then he flexed. The chain shattered like dried clay. The second chain was called dromi, twice as strong, twice as heavy. The gods brought it to Fenrir with something that might have been confidence. Fenrir shook himself once. Dromi burst apart, and the pieces scattered across the floor of Asgard like broken teeth. So Odin sent messengers to the dwarves of Nidavellir, the master craftsmen who had forged Mjolnir, who had built the ship Skidbladnir that could be folded up and put in a pocket, who had made the spear Gungnir that never missed its mark. He asked them to build a chain that could hold the wolf. And the dwarves built Gleipnir. It did not look like a chain at all. It looked like a ribbon, soft, smooth, thin as a strip of silk. The gods brought it to Fenrir, and the wolf looked at it with his burning eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he would only allow the ribbon to be placed around him if one of the Aesir gods agreed to place their hand inside his mouth as a gesture of good faith. Every god in Asgard went quiet. The Old Norse name Gleipnir likely traces to gleipa, to slip, to trick. The chain that held the wolf was forged from 6 things that do not exist: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. Because these things have no existence, the chain could not be broken by force, only by the ending of all things. Tyr stepped forward. No speech, no declaration. He walked to the wolf, looked him in the eyes, and placed his right hand between Fenrir's teeth. Gleipnir held. Fenrir pulled, once, twice, with the full force of a creature whose upper jaw would one day touch the sky. The ribbon did not move, and Fenrir bit down. The gods laughed, with relief, with triumph, with the specific laughter of people who have been genuinely terrified and have just survived. Tyr did not laugh. He stood there with the blood running down his wrist and watched them with an expression the Eddas do not describe directly, but do not need to. The wolf remembered every single god who laughed that day. But the quietest tragedy in the entire first act of Ragnarok does not belong to Tyr. It belongs to a god who was not even in the room when Gleipnir was tested, a god who had already, completely unknowingly, handed the fire giant who would burn the world tree to ash the one weapon that could have stopped him. Freyr was the Vanir god of sunlight and fertility, not a warrior god, not a king of battle, but the deity responsible for the warmth that made crops grow and the light that made winters survivable. And one afternoon, he made a catastrophic mistake. He sat in Odin's high seat, Hlidskjalf, the throne from which the Allfather could see across all 9 realms simultaneously. It was not his seat. He had no right to sit in it. But he sat down, and he looked out across the 9 realms, and his gaze fell on a giantess named Gerdr, walking across her father's courtyard in Jotunheimr. The light that came off her skin, the Eddas say, lit up both the sky and the sea. Freyr came down from the throne in a state the Skirnismal describes simply as a sickness. He could not eat. He could not sleep. He finally sent his servant Skirnir to Jotunheimr with gifts and messages. Gerdr refused the gifts. She refused the messages. Skirnir, out of options, offered Freyr's enchanted sword, the one weapon in the 9 realms described as capable of fighting giants entirely on its own, moving through the air without a hand to guide it. Gerdr agreed to meet Freyr in 9 nights. Freyr gave away his sword for 9 nights with a giantess. The Eddas do not record that he regretted it. Not once. Not even at the end, when he stood on the plain of Vigridr facing Surtur, the fire giant with the sword brighter than the sun, holding nothing but an antler because his own blade was gone. Look at what has already happened, and look at it carefully. A god consulted a dead prophet and learned the precise sequence of the end of everything, then went home and built an army he was told would not be enough. Another god lost his hand so a wolf could be chained, a wolf that will break free regardless, on a timeline the Eddas already gave you. And the one deity whose sword could have killed the fire giant who will burn the world tree to ash, traded it away for love, without regret, without hesitation, without a single line in any surviving manuscript suggesting he ever wished he had chosen differently. The gods of Asgard are not making mistakes. They are making choices, and every choice is costing them something irreplaceable. But the older texts tell a much darker story than even this. Because what comes next is not a battle. It is not a confrontation between gods and giants. What comes next is a sequence of events so quiet and so personal that most retellings rush past them entirely, which is a mistake, because these are the moments where Ragnarok stops being a cosmic event and starts being something you recognize. The dominoes are already falling. The first winter has not yet arrived. The wolf is still chained. The serpent is still coiled around the ocean floor, biting its own tail, waiting. But in Asgard, something has already gone wrong that cannot be undone. If you want to understand exactly what that is, and you do, because it changes everything about the way the final battle reads, then stay with this. Because the next sequence of events begins with the most beloved god in the entire Norse pantheon walking into a room full of people who love him, and every single one of them is about to make the same catastrophic assumption. They are going to assume that beloved means safe. Baldr was the son of Odin and Frigg, and the Eddas describe him in terms that border on the uncomfortable. Too perfect, too luminous, too beloved by every living thing in the 9 realms to feel entirely real. His face gave off light. And then he started having nightmares. The dreams came every night, vivid, specific, relentless. Dreams of his own death. He told the other gods. Frigg responded the way a mother responds when the universe threatens her child. She traveled across all 9 realms and extracted a promise from every single thing in existence. Fire, water, iron, every metal, every stone, every disease, every animal, every species of tree, every poison. That none of them would ever harm Baldr. She missed one thing, not because it was too powerful, because it was too small, too young, too insignificant to bother with. Mistletoe. When the gods discovered that Baldr had become effectively invulnerable, they turned it into a game. They stood in a circle and threw things at him. Stones, weapons, fire, and laughed as everything bounced off harmlessly. Baldr laughed too. Loki stood at the edge of the circle and watched. Here's what you need to understand about Loki at this specific moment in the mythology. He was not yet the bound god beneath the mountain. He was not yet the captain of Naglfar. He was still, technically, the blood brother of Odin, still a resident of Asgard, still invited to its feasts, still tolerated despite a reputation for causing exactly the kind of trouble that resolves itself just barely in time. He had caused crises before. He had always, at the last moment, found a way to fix them. This time he did not fix it. He slipped away from the circle, disguised himself as an old woman, and found Frigg. He asked her, in casual conversation, whether it was really true that every single thing in the 9 realms had sworn to protect her son. Frigg, proud and relieved and entirely unsuspecting, said yes. Everything except the mistletoe on the western side of Valhalla, which she had not bothered with because it was so young and small and harmless. Loki thanked her and left. He found the mistletoe. He shaped it carefully into something that could be thrown. Then he returned to the circle and found Höður, Baldr's blind brother, standing at the edge, unable to participate. Loki offered to help him join in. He placed the mistletoe branch in Höður's hands. He guided his arm. He told him where to throw. Höður threw. Baldr fell down dead. The Völuspá describes the silence that followed as the most complete silence that had ever existed in Asgard. Every god in the circle stood completely still. Höður stood with his arms still extended, not yet understanding what his hands had done, and Loki walked away. What followed was not immediate war. It was grief, vast, paralytic, the kind that empties a room of everything except the specific shape of the person who is no longer in it. Odin sat on his throne with the full weight of what this meant pressing down on him. Baldr's death was not just the loss of a son. It was the first domino of the sequence the seeress had described. The clock, which had always been running, had just become audible. They attempted a rescue. A god named Hermóðr rode Odin's horse Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, the fastest creature in the 9 realms, down into the realm of Hel and begged the goddess of the dead to release Baldr. Hel agreed, on one condition. Every single thing in the 9 realms had to weep for Baldr. Every stone, every tree, every living creature, every drop of water. If even one thing refused, Baldr stayed. Everything wept. The entire 9 realms, from the highest branches of Yggdrasil to the deepest roots, opened and mourned the dead god of light. Except one thing. In a cave at the edge of Jotunheimr, the gods found a giantess named Thok, sitting dry-eyed, unmoved, arms crossed. She told them Baldr had never done anything for her. She would not weep. Baldr could stay in Hel. The prose Edda states plainly what every reader already suspects. Thok was Loki in disguise. He had killed Baldr. And then he had gone personally to make sure Baldr could never come back. The gods of Asgard held a funeral for the light, set Baldr's longship ablaze, and watched it burn out to sea. And then they turned, collectively, to find Loki. Pay close attention to what happens next, because Loki did not run. He attended a feast, the banquet described in the Lokasenna, one of the most extraordinary documents in the entire poetic Edda. He arrived uninvited, demanded a seat on the basis of his ancient blood bond with Odin, and when they let him in, he began to speak. What followed was not an argument. It was a systematic dismantling. God by god, Loki worked his way around the room. To Odin, he recalled times the All-Father had practiced Seidr magic, considered unmanly by Norse cultural standards, and dressed as a woman among humans. To Frigg, he described her affairs with Odin's brothers. To the goddess Sif, he announced that he had slept with her. To Freyr, he pointed out that the god of sunlight had given away the only weapon that could kill giants, for love, and would regret it at the worst possible moment. He was not wrong about any of it. The gods tried to silence him. They threatened him. They sent for Thor, the one god in the hall whose presence might actually make Loki reconsider. When Thor arrived with Mjolnir in hand, Loki looked at him, delivered one final insult, and left. He knew exactly what was coming. He had been calculating this moment for longer than anyone in that room understood. And here is the detail that makes the Lokasenna genuinely unsettling on rereading. Loki was not panicking. He was not afraid. He was settling accounts. Saying out loud, to every face in the room, the truths that everyone in Asgard had been carefully not saying for centuries. He had already seen the ending. He was done pretending otherwise. The gods caught him. He had transformed himself into a salmon and hidden in a river, which the Eddas note he had actually predicted they would find, in a moment of overconfidence that cost him everything. They bound him with the entrails of his own son Narfi. A serpent was placed above his face, dripping venom directly onto his eyes. His wife Sigyn knelt beside him with a bowl to catch the drops. When the bowl filled, she had to turn away to empty it. In the seconds the venom fell before she could return, Loki screamed. The ground moved. Rocks split. Wells collapsed. Every earthquake, the Eddas tell you quietly, is Loki in the dark beneath the mountain, in the seconds when his wife has turned away. And Naglfar grew. One nail at a time, in the dark, at the edge of hell, the ship grew longer and wider and closer to finished. And somewhere in the deepest ocean, so deep that no light had ever reached it, the Midgard serpent tightened its coil around its own tail and felt, for the first time in centuries, the faintest urge to let go. And the gods of Asgard waited, and the first winter came. It came without warning, or rather, with exactly the warning the seeress had given Odin, which everyone had chosen, on some level, to hope was metaphorical. It was not metaphorical. The sun dimmed. The temperature dropped in a single day from the cold of late autumn to something beyond the reach of any word the Norse had for winter. Snow fell horizontally. Rivers froze solid within hours, and it did not stop. The Eddas call this Fimbulwinter, the great winter, the mighty winter, the final winter. 3 consecutive seasons of cold and dark with no summer between them. Crops failed in the first weeks. Livestock died in the first month. By the end of the first year, the people of Midgard were doing things to survive that the Eddas describe with a restraint that makes them more disturbing than any explicit account would be. Brother killed brother. Father killed son. The oaths that held communities together, the sworn bonds of loyalty and kinship that were, in Norse culture, the fundamental architecture of civilization, dissolved under the pressure of starvation and desperation and the specific madness that comes from 3 years without sunlight. The moral world ended before the physical world did. And this is where the lore takes a bizarre turn, because the Völuspá does not describe Fimbulwinter as a punishment. It does not describe it as something the gods sent down, or the giants engineered, or Loki arranged from his cave beneath the mountain. It describes it as a consequence, a natural result of the chain of decisions that had been made by gods and men alike across the centuries leading up to this moment. The world was not destroyed by a villain. It was worn down by accumulated choices, each of them reasonable in isolation, each of them catastrophic in combination. The wolf was chained instead of killed. The sword was traded instead of kept. The mistletoe was overlooked. The banquet was attended. The venom dripped and dripped and dripped. And then the ground began to shake, not from Loki this time, but from something much larger, deep beneath the ocean, moving for the first time in an age. The Midgard serpent was releasing its tail. The Gjallarhorn had not been blown in living memory. Heimdall kept it at the edge of heaven, at the trembling boundary where Asgard meets the void, and the Eddas say he had been standing there since before most of the gods were born, watching, listening, sleeping less than a bird sleeps, his eyesight reaching 300 leagues in every direction across the 9 realms simultaneously. He could hear wool growing on sheep. He could hear grass pushing up through frozen ground. He could hear, the prose Edda tells you, the specific sound of the ocean changing its behavior. He heard it now. The Midgard serpent releasing its tail from its own mouth did not sound like a splash. It sounded like the ocean floor shifting, a deep tectonic groan that traveled through the water and the bedrock and the roots of Yggdrasil simultaneously. A sound so low and so vast that it was less something you heard and more something you felt in the marrow of your bones. The sea rose. Not gradually, not the way tides rise, incrementally, measurably, giving you time to move to higher ground. The ocean rose the way a sleeping giant rises, all at once, without warning, with the full, indifferent weight of something that has been lying still for centuries and has finally decided to move. Coastlines that had existed since the first human settlements vanished in minutes. The ships of Midgard, already battered by 3 years of Fimbulwinter, were simply gone, lifted and swallowed by a wall of black water moving faster than anything built by human hands could outrun. And out of that rising sea, Jormungandr emerged. You have to try to hold the scale of this in your mind, because the Eddas are specific about it in a way that resists comfortable abstraction. The Midgard serpent had been coiled around the entire circumference of the world ocean. Not a large lake, not a regional sea, the entire ocean that the Norse understood to encircle the known world. The creature that uncoiled from that ocean was not a large snake. It was a living geographical feature. Its body, breaking the surface, blocked the horizon. Its head, rising above the waterline, cast a shadow over distances that would take a human being days to walk. It turned toward Asgard, and Heimdall raised the Gjallarhorn to his lips and blew. The sound of the Gjallarhorn, the Voluspa says, was heard in every one of the 9 realms simultaneously. In the halls of Asgard, every god heard it, and went still for exactly 1 moment, the length of a single breath, the last breath of the world as it had been. And then they moved. Not in panic, not in confusion. They had been waiting for this sound for longer than most of them could clearly remember. They knew exactly what it meant and exactly what came next, because Odin had made absolutely certain, across centuries of preparation, that every god in Asgard knew their role in a battle he had been told they would lose. They armed themselves and rode for Vigridr. Odin rode Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, gray as ash, the fastest creature in the 9 realms. He wore his eagle helmet and carried Gungnir, the spear that never misses. The Einherjar poured out of Valhalla behind him, centuries of the chosen dead, the warriors selected specifically for their capacity to keep fighting when everything around them had already broken. They came in numbers the Eddas describe as so vast that the columns of them marching out of Valhalla's 540 doors were wider than the eye could measure. Fenrir broke his chains at the same moment the serpent surfaced. The ribbon Gleipnir, forged from things that do not exist, unbreakable by any force in the 9 realms, simply came apart, because the force that broke it was not physical, it was temporal. The age in which Gleipnir could hold was over. The wolf stood on the plain of Asgard and opened his jaws, and the upper jaw touched the sky, and the lower jaw scraped the earth, and if there had been more space, the Eddas say, he would have opened them wider. Loki's chains broke at the same moment Fenrir's did. In his cave beneath the mountain, the entrails of his son Narfi, the bonds that had held him for longer than Fimbulwinter, longer than Baldr's death, longer than the Lokasenna, simply released. He stood up in the dark, in the silence, and felt the venom no longer falling, and listened to the sound of the Gjallarhorn echoing through the rock above him. He walked out into a world that was already ending and made his way to the shore. Naglfar was waiting. This is the moment the open loop closes. The ship that was introduced in darkness at the beginning of this story, built nail by nail from the uncut fingers and toes of the human dead, constructed across centuries in the realm of hell while the living went about their business above. It was finished. Every nail placed, every plank set, the hull pale and vast and ready, rocking gently on a sea that was still rising from Jormungandr's emergence, surrounded by the armies of hell, the ordinary dead, the ones who had not died in battle, the ones Odin's Valkyries had never selected, standing on the shore in numbers that darkened the coastline. Loki stepped aboard. He took the helm. Naglfar set sail. The plain of Vigridr, whose name means the shaking field, the place where battle surges, stretches 100 leagues in every direction, according to the Prose Edda. It was not named after Ragnarok. It existed before Ragnarok. The cosmos had prepared it, the way a body prepares a scar before the wound that will make it. When the armies arrived, the gods and the Einherjar from Asgard, the fire giants of Muspelheim led by Surtur with his sword blazing brighter than the sun, the frost giants, the armies of Hel from Naglfar's hold, the wolf with his jaw splitting the sky. Vigridr held them all without strain. The field had always been large enough. It had always known what it was for. 4 duels defined what the Eddas call the end of everything. And you need to hold all 4 of them in your mind simultaneously, because they happen at the same moment, on the same field, and each one of them ends the same way. Thor, the thunder god, the protector of Midgard, the one deity the common people of the Norse world called on most directly in their daily lives, faced Jormungandr, his own half-brother in the oldest sense of the word, both of them children of the cosmic order in different directions. They had met before. In the Eddas, every previous encounter between Thor and the serpent had ended in a draw. Thor unable to kill it, the serpent unable to kill him, both of them retreating to their respective positions in the cosmic order. Not this time. Thor raised Mjolnir. The serpent struck. What followed was not a duel in any conventional sense. It was 2 forces of equivalent cosmic weight canceling each other out, the way 2 waves of identical size destroy each other on collision. Thor killed Jormungandr. He stepped back from the body, took 1 step, took a 2nd step, took a 3rd, and on the 9th step, the venom that had entered his bloodstream during the fight reached his heart. He fell. 9 steps. The number 9 runs through the Norse mythological tradition the way a thread runs through cloth. Odin hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days, the 9 realms, 9 steps between the death of the serpent and the death of its killer. The Eddas do not explain the significance. They do not need to. 9 is the number of completion in this tradition. 9 is where things end. Odin faced Fenrir, the All-Father who had sat in his high seat and watched every event of the past centuries unfold exactly as the seeress had predicted, who had built Valhalla and assembled the Einherjar, and spent an immortal lifetime preparing for precisely this moment, charged the wolf with Gungnir leveled, the spear that never misses, aimed directly at the creature he had raised with his own hands in his own hall. The spear struck. Fenrir did not stop. The wolf swallowed Odin whole. There is no elaboration in the Eddas, no extended death scene, no final words, no slow motion. The god who had known this was coming for longer than human civilization has existed, who had looked at this specific moment across every prophecy and every consultation with every seeress and every sacrifice of his own blood, was simply gone. Swallowed. Ended. Odin's son Vidar killed Fenrir immediately afterward, driving his iron-soled boot into the wolf's lower jaw and tearing the creature apart with his hands. The Eddas describe Vidar as the god of vengeance, and note that the iron sole of his boot had been accumulating material for the whole of time. Every scrap of leather cut away from the toe and heel of every shoe ever made by human hands, saved by the cosmos specifically for this moment. The wolf died. The vengeance was completed. But Odin was still gone. Freyr faced Surtur without his sword. The Eddas do not describe this fight at length, and the brevity is its own kind of cruelty. There is no heroic exchange, no moment where Freyr nearly turns the tide with cleverness or courage. The god of sunlight and fertility, who had given away the only weapon in the 9 realms capable of fighting giants on its own, stood on the plain of Vigridr with an antler in his hands and faced the fire giant who had existed before the gods were born. It did not take long. When Freyr fell, Surtur raised his flaming sword, the one described in the Prose Edda as brighter than the sun, a detail that lands differently now that the god of sunlight is dead, and began to burn the world. Not a city, not a kingdom, the world. Yggdrasil, the world tree whose roots reached into every realm and whose branches touched the sky, caught first. The 9 realms burned from the branches inward, from the roots upward, from every direction simultaneously, until the ash fell into the sea, and the sea rose to cover what the ash had not yet reached. Heimdall and Loki killed each other in single combat. The watchman of Asgard and the bound god. The one who illuminates and the one who tangles. The first and last guardians of a door that no longer existed, canceling each other out the way cosmic opposites do, leaving nothing where both of them had been. And then there was silence over a world covered by water. This is not a story about gods losing a war. This is not a story about the end of the world as punishment for divine failure. This is not a story about defeat in any sense that the word defeat can carry in a human language built for human-scaled losses. This is a story about beings who knew, with complete, prophetically confirmed certainty, that everything they had built would be destroyed, everyone they loved would be killed, and every effort they made would ultimately be insufficient, and who looked at that knowledge and looked at each other and chose to build anyway, to love anyway, to fight anyway. The Einherjar fought on Vigridr long after every major god had fallen. The chosen dead, selected across centuries for their capacity to keep going when everything had already broken, kept fighting in the ash and the rising water until there was nothing left to fight for, and nowhere left to stand. They had been trained for exactly this. They were exactly what Odin had built them to be. It did not save the world. Nothing was going to save the world. That was never the point. The Völuspá does not end with the burning. This is the detail that separates the Norse cosmological tradition from every other mythological apocalypse in the ancient world. The Greek Titans, once defeated, stay defeated. Chained in Tartarus forever, the cosmic order permanently resolved in favor of Olympus. The Egyptian underworld is a bureaucratic system of judgment and rebirth, carefully managed, never truly at risk of collapse. The Mesopotamian flood myths end with divine regret and a promise of restraint. The Norse seeress, raised from her grave by a one-eyed king who already knew what she would say, describes the burning of the 9 realms in precise and unflinching detail. And then she keeps talking. She describes the earth rising again from the water, green and new, waterfalls running down from mountains that have no names yet, eagles hunting fish in rivers that no human foot has ever touched. She describes the surviving gods, Baldr returning from hell, Höður beside him, the brothers reconciled in a world where the thing that divided them no longer exists. She describes a hall rising on the plain of Vigridr, on the same ground where everything ended, thatched with gold, brighter than the sun that Freyr is no longer alive to represent. She describes two human beings, a man and a woman, who survived Fimbulwinter and the burning by sheltering inside Yggdrasil itself, inside the heartwood of the world tree, fed on the morning dew, emerging into this new world and beginning again. The Norse did not build a mythology of pure annihilation. They built a mythology of annihilation followed by something quieter and more difficult. The specific courage required to begin again in the ruins of everything you knew, without the gods who raised you, without the certainties that structured the world before the fire. And this is the first thing the oldest texts want you to take away from the story of Ragnarok. The Norse people who preserved this myth, the warriors and farmers and seafarers of Scandinavia who lived inside a cosmology where even the gods were mortal, where the world tree could burn, where the sun could go dark for 3 consecutive years, did not use this story to comfort themselves. They used it to calibrate themselves. A culture that builds its central mythological narrative around the certain knowledge that everything ends and the choice to act with integrity anyway is a culture that has decided, collectively, that the quality of how you live matters more than the duration. Courage, in the Norse tradition, was not the absence of fear. Odin was afraid. The Eddas show you his fear in every consultation with every seeress, in every sacrifice, in every desperate preparation. Courage was what you did with the fear. It was the decision to ride for Vigridr anyway, to carry Gungnir anyway, to look the wolf in the eyes and charge. That is the first takeaway, and it belongs to a civilization that earned it. The second thing the story of Ragnarok holds up for you, if you are willing to look directly at it, is a mirror. You live in a world that has its own version of Fimbulwinter, its own slow accumulations of consequence, ecological, political, social, that no single decision caused and no single decision can reverse. You have your own prophecies, delivered not by dead seeresses, but by scientists and historians, and the long memory of every civilization that came before yours and made the same calculations and arrived at the same conclusions. You know, with varying degrees of certainty, about various endings. And you spend a remarkable amount of energy finding reasons why this specific prophecy might be wrong, why this particular warning might be an exaggeration, why the mistletoe is too small and young and insignificant to bother with. The gods of Asgard did the same thing. They were wrong in exactly the same way. And the Eddas recorded their wrongness not as a condemnation, but as a recognition. Because the impulse to believe that the thing you love might survive is not weakness. It is the most human response to an unbearable truth that exists. The question the mythology actually asks you is not whether you can prevent the ending. It is what you choose to do with the time between now and then. That is the second takeaway. And it is not comfortable. It was not designed to be. The third thing, the last thing, is the one that stays with you after the screen goes dark. It is quieter than the others. It does not announce itself. You are going to die. Not as a philosophical abstraction, not as a statistical certainty filed away in the part of your mind where you keep the things you know but prefer not to think about. You are going to die. The people you love are going to die. And everything you have built together, the specific texture of your daily life, the private language of your closest relationships, the small rituals that make ordinary days feel inhabited rather than merely endured, all of it will end. The world tree burns for everyone. The wolf breaks every chain eventually. The Norse gods knew this. They knew it with a specificity and a certainty that no human being is ever asked to carry. They had the exact date, the exact sequence, the exact name of the creature that would end each of them. And they chose. Every single one of them, from Odin on his high seat to Freyr standing on Vigridr with an antler in his hands, to love what they loved and fight for what they fought for and build what they built, right up to the moment the fire reached them. Tyr lost his hand so that the world could have a few more centuries of the wolf being chained. A few more centuries. He knew Gleipnir would not hold forever. He put his hand in the wolf's mouth anyway. That is not a story about a god. That is a story about every human being who has ever loved something fragile and chosen to protect it anyway, knowing that protection is temporary, that the chain will eventually fail, that the wolf is always, somewhere, pulling. You are going to lose the things you love. You already know this. The question Ragnarok has been asking you, from the moment the seeress opened her mouth in the cold dark of the underworld, is not how to prevent the loss. It is whether you will put your hand in the wolf's mouth anyway. Did Odin genuinely believe, in the last second before Fenrir's jaws closed, that he might find a way out? Or did the Allfather, the god who had sacrificed his eye for wisdom and hung himself on the world tree for 9 days and spent centuries preparing for a battle he had been told he could not win? Did he charge that wolf already at peace with what was coming? Tell me what you think in the comments below, because the oldest texts do not answer that question. They leave it open, the way fate leaves everything open. Not because the answer does not exist, but because the answer is yours to find. In the choices you make between now and your own Vigridr, in what you decide to protect and what you decide to trade away, and whether you remember to cut the nails of your dead. The nail ship is still out there, somewhere at the edge of things, and it is not finished yet.